Hey Pedro, how's it going?
I'm a little tired at the end of the semester, but you know how it goes. It's getting there.
I do. Yeah. When does your semester end? You guys
Um,
go to the end of the month or?
no, so CU Boulder ends first, or I think CU Boulder ends like May 10th-ish, and then CU Denver started 1 week later, so that'll be an extra week there. So probably like middle of May I'll be done.
All right. Yeah, same here for
Yeah.
me and Jack. About a month to go. Hey Jack,
How's it going?
we're just both tired.
Yeah, feel that.
Yeah.
Let me get some lights on.
I see that you've been doing a lot of good work. I've been following the podcast videos that you've been participating in. Watched and read about some of those. So I'm excited to um, some of the things that you've posted recently. I've found very interesting. I think it's maybe relevant also to what we're talking about today.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I haven't been as busy as usual, I guess. Only like two or three podcasts in the last couple of weeks, but um
I don't know. I don't know how you do it with all the teaching and also all the extra material putting out. That maybe you just desensitized to it by now. I'm still getting there.
I guess I like to talk. I guess that's what happened. But
How much
yeah.
are you teaching, Pedro?
4 classes. Probably it's four
That's a
preps,
lot.
so just the four
Okay, four
preps is.
preps. Jeez.
And last semester it was five. That was the most miserable semester ever. I probably
How
worst.
different are the classes?
Um, so I taught one intro to ethics class, a logic class, a kind of like great books class,
Mhm.
um, and then a history of science class, and then an intro to philosophy class.
Wow.
So
Wow.
not too much overlap.
It's a lot
Sometimes
of
it
gear
did. I
shifting.
tried, but that was miserable. I'm never doing that again.
Wow. I think you and I have it easy, Jack.
Yeah, compared to that, for sure.
Oh, teaching wise, sure, but yeah, I'm trying to get that. My rule now is no more than 4 preps. Five is too much. Four is manageable, but I didn't have a life.
I've never had more than three preps. So
We're getting there. We're getting there. Yeah, I went from never having more than one to having five, so that was a little traumatic, but it builds
damn.
character, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we put in the work now and in 10 or 20 years we won't have to answer any emails ever and we never give papers back and just sort of relax like some of the elder faculty seem to. No, I love all my elder faculty members. They're great.
Wink, wink.
You do need to relax at some point, though.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, I've been reflecting on Plotinus. It's so fun to dig into this. I mean, I like you, Jack, and maybe Pedro, you've read Plotinus in the original recently, at least, if not just before this, but just digging into that again and that issue of the relationship between the individual soul and the world soul that he talks about. And
Mhm.
um, what was it, book in the sixth Ennead, book five,
Yeah, and four. Yeah.
and four, yeah. So interesting. And then bringing this Deleuzian reading into the mix
Hmm.
is provocative, but I don't, maybe we could just start though with like I'd love to hear your each of you like your general reflection on the relevance of Plotinus today and like is this I mean I kind of already know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. You know, are we studying Plotinus right now because it's historically important and so as good like museum curators of the history of ideas, we want to kind of make sure there's a nice exhibit for Plotinus um, and his ideas are arranged in the proper way? Or is this more like we're drawn to his ideas? And I think I am drawn to his ideas. I want to get them right. And, you know, we can have a nice museum exhibit also, but I think there's still something alive in these in this vision and as a guide to contemplative life and self-transformation and even in terms of metaphysics, but that does leave us with the problem of figuring out how to square what Plotinus is up to with this multi-leveled um, depiction of reality, how to square that with like contemporary science, physics, biology, cosmology, evolutionary cosmology. And it might be easier to do that than we think, but I'm just curious, yeah, how do each of you relate to this thinker and this text, the Enneads? Um, I don't know, maybe Pedro, you go first.
That's a good question. I guess I never stopped to explicitly think about it, and so my only entry to it is its relevance to me. And so through its relevance to me, hopefully I can convey its relevance, I think, to people in general. Um, but I think what really drew me to Plotinus, well, besides it sort of elucidating certain experiences that I have that were, for me, like epistemically, like life-changing, I guess.
Mm.
Um, I think the concept of the one is very illuminating for illuminating those kinds of called, I guess, mystical experiences, but also just in general, um, the way he merges metaphysics and ethics, I think, is what I what really draws me to Plotinus is um, how I guess deeper introspection into the self, I guess, instead of going out, going in, sort of the psychological method, which Bergson points out is Plotinus's a method that you take the psychological method, and it's almost like in discovering more about yourself, um, and the soul and the soul's relation to the world, like you go so far into yourself that you eventually come out again. There's a greater understanding of your place in the world, and that metaphysical understanding of the soul and where the soul comes from is also, I guess, an ethical teaching, and that the I guess what we talked about the lower and the higher part of the soul and ascending to the higher part of the soul isn't just metaphysically transformative or philosophically, but it's ethically transformative too. And it makes me think of one of the things that you sent out recently, Matt, was talking about going to a Eastern Orthodox service, and there's an Eastern Orthodox church right next to my where I live, my house. And I have been resistant to going. I've been meaning to go because I had met someone last year who's Eastern Orthodox and really changed my view of Christianity, in a way that made me curious for the first time ever in my life to go to a service. And I've been meaning to go for a while. And what really drew me into it was in my dissertation when I wrote about the divine energies in Eastern Orthodoxy, the participation in those. I get that a lot in Plotinus. I feel a lot of similarity there in that, um, almost as if contemplation for Plotinus is something similar to participating in the divine energies in Orthodox Christianity. And so I think that's what really keeps drawing me to Plotinus is how can I learn more from you in order to have these sort of transformative experiences that essentially can help me get back to the source, the deification that he talks about. Um, and in that sense, I think the relevance of it too is that in trying to talk to people about these sorts of experiences, especially having students that are so committed usually blindly or to moral relativism, or but also feel a lot of hunger for spirituality, um, or a spiritual practice. I think I found in Plotinus and also Buddhism ways to talk about um, spirituality or taking the good seriously, for example, in ways that don't necessarily have to bring in a stereotypical Christian God, the triple O, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient God, which pushes so many people away from taking ethics and goodness seriously. I think these are alternative discourses in history that can help us bring people back to see that, these are, in my view, mostly paths that lead to a similar, if not the same source. And so I think recovering Plotinus and, for example, Buddhism and teaching that especially can be a way of sort of reviving a healthy sort of spirituality.
Mm. Love that. What do you think, Jack?
I mean, it's such a weird text. Going back through it and like reading more, like I've never read the whole thing, and reading more of it at this point, it it is like almost like a fever dream at times that is like full of very clear thinking, but like somewhere that there's like a lens that's being shifted, or like the perspective is being constantly altered, or he'll just like all of a sudden be arguing with the Gnostics, or suddenly be arguing with the Stoics, or like end a sentence and be like, okay, let's drop that and move back to the topic. And it's like, wasn't that the topic? Like, you can never like figure out why he's doing what he's doing at any moment. It's such a strange text.
Is that Pottery's fault, or is that because he arranged it
I
all,
don't
right?
know. Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Well, let's blame him and not maybe it's
Yeah.
not.
I mean, I think that at least partially the ordering, there was no like order to it. I mean,
Yeah.
so Plotinus didn't leave us like something that Porphyry like messed up. I don't think. I think Porphyry arranged. But anyway, I mean, I think that regardless of that seeming unsystematic nature of the flow of the dialogue, he is just like returning to the same ideas and chipping away at them anew in new language with new metaphors, and undermining what prior metaphors he gave in order to expand the thought and not get trapped in certain ideas and things like that. So I think one of the like really rich things in Plotinus is what it is to engage with the text. Like you said, Matt, it's like a living text. And I really think that, the same thing applies to Plato and the dialogues, especially, like, well, the dialogue form, especially, that it's not about a certain set of doctrines that you're going to find and then get the perfect argument for it and then say, okay, I have a set of ideas, but it actually, and this is the ethical thing, like it changes you when you interact with these ideas. And there's something skillful in the way that the ideas are presented, which is stimulating for philosophy. And I think that it has continued to be this incredible resource for thinking new ideas that aren't even necessarily Plotinus's ideas. I mean, maybe they're spawns of Plotinus's ideas that evolve into a new direction, but I'm really seeing like Leibniz, and then uh Bergson, and then Whitehead, and like as just sort of re-evaluating the same set of problems. And like when we get to Deleuze, like an idea is a problem, and a problem is like a multiplicity of perspectives that we need to mull over, like from a whole bunch of different perspectives, like from all of the possible vantage points, not in order to synthesize some clear and distinct proposition at the end, but to be transformed through that process somehow. So I think that sort of living text aspect of it, and the ethical potential that it has as well, from that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate, Pedro, you connecting ethics and metaphysics, emphasizing that Plotinus is suggesting that for us to know the truth, we have to become like it in a way. We have to transform ourselves first, or in the process of that. The process of knowing is a process of self-transformation, maybe, and aligning with the good. And that's a process of theosis and deification. And I think some of, Iamblichus and Proclus, other Neoplatonists, really do emphasize the ritual dimension of that. And so it's an important connection to like the Eastern Orthodox Church and what liturgy means, not just as a representation of the truth, but as an enactment of it. And then, yeah, Jack, it is a bit like a fever dream, this text.
I write in the margins like the major idea of each paragraph, and then you see them kind of like cycling back through. Like he'll bring up participation and talk about that, and then all of a sudden be on something else, and then it comes up again, and you have to like read the passages off of each other and see how the positions have evolved in between.
Yeah, well, it's very clear that he's philosophizing in response to mystical experience, right?
Yeah.
And admitting right off the bat that we could only ever have a fragmentary intellectual grasp of that. Even of the intellect, we can only have a fragmentary grasp with our finite minds. But he knows intuitively that there is one source, and whether the source is a cause or a creator or an overflow. I mean, we can talk about the metaphors he uses to describe how source becomes, how cause becomes effect, or maybe
Right.
saying cause is already too much,
Mhm.
um, but like we can have a intuitive, almost revelation of the oneness and the systematic nature of knowledge and ideas, but in practice, as we're actually trying to write about it, it's going to be fragmentary.
Yeah.
And um, I couldn't help but feel how, like, even though he's writing what, third century, is that right?
Yeah, I
Um,
think so.
it feels so resonant with like a lot of the romantics, like Fichte, for example, and how I mean, what's going on with the overflowing of the intellect from the one, and the intellect generating itself through its own turning back or returning to contemplate the one. It just reminds me so much of Fichte talking about how the I and the not I, and this process of self-positing, whereby through a differentiation from oneself, the self is actually generated.
Mhm.
Um, but then also just the fragmentary nature of his writing. It's very much like these romantic fragments that like
Mhm.
the Schlegel brothers for like really emphasize that romantic philosophy is all about the fragment. And that's not to say there isn't system. It's just to say the best we can do is, you know, you try to capture a thought on a page like a leaf loss, exfoliating from the plant as an expression of the archetype of the plant, but a unique facet of that oneness of the archetype each time. Um, so yeah, it's still a text that continues to prove generative, like for every generation of philosophers, maybe.
Yeah.
Not only the German romantics and idealists, but Bergson, obviously, and Deleuze. Um, so yeah, I mean, maybe we can transition to the Deleuzean reading.
I did have a quick question, Matt, because you mentioned in what you, an email that I got from one of the I forget exactly which one it was, but where you mentioned the idea or the idea that you're developing of truth as participation. And maybe we can either talk about this now or tie it in later if you think it's relevant. But I was wondering if if one of the problems that for me or questions that I have is like that Zavada talks about a lot is, well, how do these hypostases interact with each other if in a sense they're separate? That's really explicit with the one in the intellect, right? If the one is not doing anything, where does intellect come from? And so maybe having spatial metaphors isn't most helpful for trying to understand this, because I think of concepts very visually, but there's a certain limit to which that goes, right? When you look up hypostases in on Google, for example, you'll see like three spheres. So spatially, they seem completely disconnected, and so like a spatial metaphor probably just won't do it. And so might be a question for now or for later if you think it's more relevant for later. But if you think the concept of truth as participation might be a better sort of metaphor of or way of conceiving how these three hypostases could sort of interact or participate in each other.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good connection. I mean, I think the idea of participation goes through some um, changes from Plato through Thomas Aquinas through um, the Romantics. Um, so like, for Plato, participation means mimicking the original, or like the copy of the idea participates in, like, physical things participate in the ideal form. And
Yeah.
so there's a kind of derivative nature to it, and it's kind of representational. But then in Aquinas, you get a little bit more of a actually our me and Jack's colleague Jake Sherman has written about this, the genealogy of participation. Um, Aquinas has more of an existential understanding, and in the way that being participates in all beings, and the way that like the divine act is what allows anything else to exist. And then so there's this it's not that different from Plato, but it's a little bit more embodied, I guess. Um, and then in Schelling and the Romantics, there's this more like expressive form of participation where the one way sense of like there being the idea or the divine that is not so much that the divine is participating in the created thing, but that the created thing is participating in the divine. And Schelling, you get much more of a sense of co-creation, where the division between creature and creation really breaks down. And it's that latter form of participation that I'm trying to lean into. And maybe there needs to be further mutations, but really it's wanting to understand truth in the sense that would be compatible with like what Deleuze is suggesting about the virtual and the actual, and not um not thinking of actualization as a process whereby a possibility is realized um in the old Platonic sense, like the bad Platonic sense. There's more going on in Plato than that, um but instead recognizing that like all that the virtual does, like the virtual is always a process of actualization, and it's more like crystallization out of a super saturated fluid. And there's a lot of Gilbert Simondon going on in Deleuze's thought, and in this article that wasn't so much mentioned. But I think Deleuze is getting this from
Mm,
and Bergson, but yeah, so it's more like Deleuze, but I worry that the kind of truth that I'm trying to articulate wouldn't be I'm not as happy with like Deleuze's nominalism and like I'm anti a certain kind of essentialism, but I feel like how do we avoid ending up with moral relativism? How do we avoid
mm,
form just being a matter of abstraction from particulars and having no
mhm, mhm,
role in this process of co-creation? It's like,
mhm,
yes, we're creating the forms just as much as the forms are creating us, but like I want
mhm,
form to have a little bit more ontological heft than I feel like Deleuze is willing to give us. But
mm,
does that make sense?
Yeah, sort of related to the idea of like an open teleology. Like
Mm,
it's
mm,
not closed, it's open-ended, but there still makes room for a final formal cause, even though it's not a once and for all like essentialized
mhm, mhm,
yes.
formal or final cause.
Right.
mhm.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, maybe let's see if Jack has something to add to that before I go on.
Well, I wanted to just like expand on the idea of the virtual a little bit because I do feel like that's probably the most Platinian aspect. I mean, I really think the virtual goes back to Aristotle to some degree. This kind of making a distinction between the real and the possible, and the actual and the virtual, and like separating those things out. Like the Aristotle goes for that first, and like you have this whole series of terms related to hexis, having. So you have synexis, which is continuity, metexis, which is participation. Um, all these other words like containment is pari ekein. So and then entelekia is based on this, and all of these terms kind of are the dynamism of the virtual and the actual, right? And we can think of like the soul participate, or sorry, the body participates in the soul, and all of these things. Like there's this inner thread there that we can only theorize about, I guess, to some degree, in the same way that Leibniz kind of says, we have to theorize about monads or something like that. Like we don't see the interstitial web of potentiality and actuality on the surface of things, right?
Yeah.
It can be denied whether potentiality or possibility even exists, right? Like you have the Megarian kind of thing within Aristotle, which is the denial of possibility or potentiality. I should say potentiality, not possibility, because we want to separate those. And I guess to clear that up, potentiality being a concept or a representation of a possible existence, but that does not exist, right? Has reality kind of negated from it. This is Bergson's analysis of the problem. So, I mean, I think that the virtual ends up being very much this inchoate force, or you could say latent activity emerging into activity, but on the verge of actualizing itself, not yet actualizing itself, right? So you have the soul kind of descending to the body and preparing to enter into the body, and the body kind of, again, latent soul, like it has a potential that is gradually yearning for actualization. And I think this middle ground between, and this is where you get like the Stoic idea of tension, right? This realm between possible and actual, which is in the process of actualizing itself. So they use the term tonos to talk about this, and it's connected with the whole hexis thing, because hexis and eke and telekia and all of these, and metexis, all of these dynamism words, the Stoics connect that with tonos, or you know, intention, extension, the whole set of verbs related to that, and understanding between pure actuality and pure potentiality. They want to say there's no pure potentiality and there's no pure actuality other than in the cycle of conflagration. Not to get too off topic here with all of this, but so I guess this idea of the whole realm of being that isn't present on the surface of things, which is their entelekia, their potentiality, their tension, whatever. The prototype for this in Plotinus, or prototype, I don't know if that's the right word, but like the paradigm for this is the way that we have a set of ideas before we start talking or thinking about something. So, you know, coming into this meeting, we've all been thinking about Plotinus for the past couple of weeks. We have all these ideas, kind of connections to be made. It's in this virtual state of potential to articulate a whole connection of interrelated ideas. And as we see with the book itself, you can connect those in a multiplicity of nonlinear ways, and you get different ideas when you do that, right? So I really think of it as kind of this kaleidoscope, or you have this mass, almost infinite mass of connection possibilities. And Deleuze will think of this as like differential, like a cloud of differentials and events and things. And then you can interconnect that in, you know, I think rhizomatically, you can interconnect that in an infinite number of ways. You can take the same intelligibles and, you know, endlessly articulate them.
So you brought up the, like, when you're explaining the virtual idea of like talking about Plotinus, right? That there's all these potential connections that can be made because we've been thinking about it. And that sounds very much like what she was saying when she was talking about, when Zavada was talking about the virtual idea of language, capital I language for Deleuze. And so
yeah, that was really good.
Yeah, and so I guess for you, I read that as Deleuze's way of talking about language. And so I guess, where do you think that Plotinus, I guess, converges with Deleuze in terms of using this example? Where do they converge, or where do they diverge in this example of language?
I mean, Deleuze is all about the material element of it, right? Like you have all these phonemes, and the phonemes have all of these possible, not even possible, we should say virtual differential relations within them. I don't know, logos for Plotinus is, I don't know if it operates in the same way. It's like this idea of the expressed principle. I mean, definitely Deleuze takes some ideas from Stoicism about logos and about the lecta, and this idea of kind of a logic of dynamism, or a logic of the will to power, or something from Nietzsche that he sees in Stoicism that sort of undermines the logos of logic, right? Something is getting smaller, right? It is also getting bigger, because what it isn't anymore is still what it is. So the fact that I was bigger a minute ago means I'm getting bigger somehow, right? These kind of Stoic logic problems that Deleuze looks at in like logic of sense and things like that. Yeah, it gets at that the like the logic of the sensible. So I mean, I think that we don't Plotinus, like half the time he's like, the sensible is just matter, it's just evil, or it's just illusion, or it's just these things. Like you would never hear Deleuze say these things.
So like getting at, like, Deleuze wants to put the sensible on the same plane as the intelligible.
Definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But does
Mm.
Plotinus want to do that too in some moments? Like there do seem to be moments when he wants to do that. And that's what this article is like championing, right? That even within Plotinus, there's this reversal of Platonism in the matter versus ideal. Um,
Mhm. Yeah. I like to say, I mean, I like to think there's already that reversal in Plato too,
yeah.
um,
That's fun.
in the way that, the receptacle plays such an important role in the Timaeus. Um, and, something I think we touched on last time we spoke is the sense you get in Plotinus of contemplation, which is only possible because the one overflows
Mm-hmm.
itself,
Mm-hmm.
actually allows the one to be good.
Mm-hmm.
Like the one becomes good only in its contemplation
Mm-hmm.
by these
Interesting.
hypostases, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or that's at least a way of describing the implication of what Plotinus is suggesting here. And so in some sense, mm, the return is more valuable or makes somehow enhances the superabundance of the one, if that's even
Mm-hmm.
if I could even say that. I mean, it's already
Mm-hmm.
superabundant, but it's so superabundant it produces this process whereby its goodness can ever increase,
Mm-hmm.
through the contemplation by the intellect, by the soul, and even by every being in nature is contemplating the one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, I mean, this is all, I'm already trying to lean more into this like co-creative understanding of participation, where like
Yeah.
the the contemplation of the one by each of the many actually is enhancing the one in some way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. I guess
which
that's
might
like
not be a
the concept.
Platinian reading, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the reading I would want to give,
Mm-hmm.
the Whiteheadian spin I'd want to put on it,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe Deleuzian. Um, but um, the logos, though, I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
go back to talk about that because if it plays this mediating role, right, um,
Yeah.
between the unity of the intellect and the multiplicity of beings and of even of bodies. Um, but I think we also talked last time about the difference that like some understanding of the incarnation might make here and the relationship between the logos and in the body,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
and whether Plotinus seems to come up short there. There's this line actually where he talks about the nature of contemplation as erasing the lines. He says, "My act of contemplation makes what it contemplates. As I contemplate, the lines which bound bodies come to be as if they fell from my contemplation." So it's like he steps into the role of, I guess, the soul in being the power which gives shape to bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process of contemplation, he's actually um, unfalling, in a sense, out of the body back into the soul,
Mm-hmm.
erasing the lines of the body. I just thought that line about
Yeah. There's a
quite
similar line to that when it's in the first Aeneid, which I was also going through, and he's talking about evil, and he says something like the idea. So evil comes because of matter, but matter is not evil. And he says something like it's not about thinking that bodies and earthly existence is evil somehow
Mhm.
inherently. He's like, there's a way to be here in a dignified and holy way, basically, through
Yeah,
virtue and philosophy and things like that.
right.
So he does like these, like he uses these language of the Phaedo and stuff like that, where we despise the body, we call it a tomb, and we make matter evil and stuff. But he also like works around those things and tries to give them a like merely metaphoric positionality, I think.
Right. Is it, I mean, maybe I can connect this to what you were saying earlier, Pedro, about the like psychological method here and the way in which it's almost like we need to go in and become, mm, recognize the ethical implications of our modes of attention, and like that the way we attend to the world actually changes the world. And so if we think of the sensory world of extended bodies as the most real, then Plotinus would say we're deluded. We're very confused about the nature of sensible bodies, because he would say actually sensibility itself is only possible because of the soul. Bodies are only formed because of the soul. And so to see the sensory world the right way around, we have to first have gone inward and recognized our own rational souls, like the intelligible nature of the soul. To see the actually the sensible world of bodies is it's not that it's just an illusion if we see it rightly as a what, not a reflection of. I mean, maybe that is, maybe Plotinus is still in a representational mode of thought, so that it is a reflect. He wants us
Well,
to see it as a reflection of
in
the
in
intelligence.
the section that we were talking about, the 6.4, I think, he says like there are multiple ways that we can mean image, and like if a fire heats an object and you remove the object from the fire, the object still has an image of fire in it somehow because it remains warm. And he says this is totally unlike a body
Mhm.
that casts a shadow, because you can't remove the shadow from the body. So and then he uses this to understand the way that the soul is within the extended world and things like that.
Is this like the difference between intensive and extensive
Yeah, I think so. I
properties?
mean, this is
Yeah.
where he really gets into it. And then he talks about this like sphere of light, which also comes up in the article.
Yeah.
And he says like if you remove the, I mean, it's a weird thought experiment, but if you remove the little clump at the middle and still have the power of the light, then it would be everywhere, right? And I think, yeah, it's an intensive quality. And then he immediately takes it to life and says like imagine trying to remove a part of a living thing. Well, then that part is no longer living. Um, so
Yeah.
That reminds me, one question that came up for me, you brought up the intensive, is this is a concept I struggled with a little bit when I had to write about it for my dissertation. But this reading kind of helped a lot. And one idea that helped, which I was wondering if you got the same impression. So intensive, like for example, he takes this from science, as the article points out, right? That temperature is an intensive property. If I have a block that's like 50 degrees, I split it in half, both blocks are still 50 degrees, right? So these aren't properties that don't depend on extension. Um, uh, and then but the connection that I think I made, which I hope is helpful, if but you're about to tell me whether it's helpful or not, is that the intensive, Deleuze writes about it as what allows the virtual to be actualized, right? It's kind of the bridge between the actual and the virtual. And I was wondering if what Deleuze means by the intensive is what Whitehead means by eternal object, or if how close they are to each other, because was thinking of color, for example, that like color, like as redness is an internal object that's ingressed. Um, there's a parallel there to be made with the intensive, for example, because the redness of something isn't something that is dependent or a part of its material nature, right? But it's still ingressed somehow, and so the intensive would be the means by which the idea of redness is actualized, which sounds to me, if I'm right in how in the way of explaining things, sounds a lot like how Whitehead talks about eternal object.
oh, Matt, you're not
You're
paused.
muted.
Sorry. Paused. I was thinking about how to connect this to Whitehead, and usually I think of the virtual as akin to what Whitehead means by eternal objects, but
Okay.
there's a little tension there because Whitehead thinks of the eternal objects as definite potentials in his terms, which at least on the face of it is not what Deleuze wants to say, but it could end up meaning something similar to what Deleuze means by the virtual. And this is an area where I think I've struggled with Whitehead. How definite are the eternal objects? Like,
Mm-hmm.
because he doesn't want to conceive of them as just like floating out there independent of actual occasions or actual entities. And so what definiteness can they have prior to being prehended by some actual entity is the question that I've been mulling over for a long time actually. But in terms of how to map it loosely, I would say virtual maps to eternal objects, actualization maps to actual occasions, and then that leaves the intensive to be more like what Whitehead means by historical roots or societies, in the sense that
Or
intensive.
what about just prehension even? Do you think that could be?
um, Akin
I mean,
to
insofar as like the surge of feeling, right? Isn't the prehension kind of this
mm,
swelling of, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I
But I
thought,
mean,
I mean, there was some connection between um, the intensive and this idea of assemblage
mhm,
um, in Deleuze, right? And so I was
yeah.
thinking that seemed resonant with with Whitehead's idea of societies or
Yeah.
nexus.
Mhm.
Um,
Isn't a nexus in a society kind of a prehension that encapsulates a multiplicity of occasions, kind of?
um, it's a society is a group of occasions that share a definite characteristic, and a nexus is just a more a more loosely related
Mm.
grouping. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how helpful it is. I mean, it's inevitable that we try to, it's like for me at least, I try to learn Deleuze's vocabulary and concepts by relating it to what I know better, which is Whitehead. Um,
Well, um, it just to expand on this a little bit, maybe if unless you were about to go somewhere.
no, please go ahead. I'll look for that line about assemblage I
Well,
was trying to find earlier.
oh, cool, yeah. The idea of intensive, I think we can think through effort to some degree. I mean, that's the way that the Stoics go for this, and I think it applies in Plotinus, and then picked up by the French spiritualist and even Leibniz, and then gets handed off to Bergson. Um, that when you're like muscular effort, like in Mandabaron, he talks about like if you're, and this is Leibnizian physics to some degree, with the idea of kinetic energy, living force, dead force, and like his intensive views. So, you know, when you start to push, there's a sort of tension building up and a uh, intention to make movement, let's say, through force, and you start to move, and then the object starts moving, but you have perceptual feedback which allows you to modulate how much force you're doing out. So in this, intensive calculate, I don't want to use the word calculation because Bergson would be really against that, but a kind of regulation of force, living force within activity that results in movement and which is in a kind of feedback with intelligence, right? I mean, I think something like that, those components, is what is included in logos, or like an expressed principle. And this is really like the dynamism of form in the living world, right?
Mhm.
And I think Plotinus like takes this stoic metaphysics of tension, intensive properties, through the idea of effort. So in Greek, tonos means tension, but it also means effort. So the terms are synonymous. Um, and yeah, so was that?
Interesting. Yeah. Um, I mean, I think you're right that the idea of intensive connection could be understood as akin to prehension.
Hmm.
Um, but the idea of these rhizomatic assemblages, um, it's almost like in denying any vertical access to
Mm-hmm.
loses,
Mm-hmm.
is almost like he wants to speak in Whiteheadian terms, like he wants the particulars of of the world process to be connected only via physical prehension, or at least he wants to define conceptual prehension in terms of the virtuality out of which actualization occurs, rather than as a, in Whitehead, it's almost like you have the past coming in through physical prehension, and then there's just this other
Mm.
there's another dimension of pure possibility, or
Right.
um, the definite potentiality of eternal objects. And it's an aspect of Whitehead that I really get why he wants to maintain that, but also feels problematic because it, in an effort to avoid nominalism, he's really creating a new kind of dualism between eternality and actuality, which maybe as Bergsonians, you guys are probably okay with some kind of dualism, at least a pedagogical kind.
Well, so there's also so you have immortal, wait, there's eternal objects, and then there's, what's the immortal?
Objective immortality.
Objective immortality. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because objective immortality is how actuality kind of accumulates and is somewhat like the eternal, but it's different than the eternal. Because, I mean, I think people use the term sempiternal or something like that, where
Yeah.
didn't exist at one time, but now it exists forever.
He says that the process of actualization, as each actual occasion becomes objectively immortal, casts the shadow of truth back upon the realm of eternal objects, so that, yeah, what's objectively immortal in some sense becomes part of it enriches the eternal. It becomes
right.
But
okay, sorry, finish the thought. Yeah, I was going to
well,
take
I
this
was
back
just
to
trying
Plotinus.
I was just trying to think of how to say something that sounds contradictory on the face of it. The eternal is growing. It's like,
yeah. Well, I mean, couldn't like Plotinus' robust idea of the intellect like accept that like maybe from a certain perspective, like Socrates, whatever, like he's a favorite idea of one of the intelligibles that Plotinus always talks about. Socrates like does something unexpected and like creates an actual occasion that is then a mortal object that is reflected through the infinite prism of relations within the other intelligibles and somehow enriches them and expands them. And like paradoxically, that's not like, that doesn't like, well, it breaks the rules because you can't change the intelligibles. They are what they are. But at the same time, you can, because the intelligibles are always more than what you think they are. And like by situating them in different ways, novelty and like freedom and creativity can like burst into the universe.
Right.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, just quickly, like the idea of limitation is so important for Whitehead as what actually makes value, what brings value into the world.
It's very Greek.
Yeah, yeah. And yet creativity is infinite, and like you're saying, there are infinitely many eternal objects. So like when you affirm the infinitude of that realm of definite potentials, you're never going to run out of novelty to draw upon. And you're also able, from our perspective as self-conscious contemplative co-creators, sub-creators, self-creating creatures, to use Whitehead's term, it could seem like we are able to, with each new event and unfolding in life, contemplate the eternal anew, like because you can't step in the same river twice. You can't contemplate the same eternity twice, because you're different. And yet, what are we in our highest intelligible nature but an expression of that very one? And so we can't but affirm its ongoing growth, I guess. So
I mean, yeah, like to augment this exact thought, like how could Plotinus not think that partially? uh if he's writing like a new book, right? Like he says like what I say should resonate with Plato and Aristotle, but he says even like it's okay if it just, if the best we can do is that it doesn't disagree with them. Like we don't have to agree with them,
Mm.
but we should like just not disagree with them, which is like so weird. And again, like I really think he's doing this, like you said, like what he's doing is trying to understand reality in light of mystical experience, right? I
Mhm.
think we've agreed on that. But he's trying to rewrite the ideas of Plato and Aristotle while satisfying that other thing. And it almost doesn't matter if what he like, he doesn't think like the goal is not just to rewrite or like write commentaries or introductory works to Plato, or just make them more accessible or something like that. He has a huge project of his own, right? And
Mm.
how could he do that if he didn't think there were new ideas that we could crack into and that would like change everything and make our understanding of things different?
Right.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, this brings me back to what feels to me like possibly a limitation in Deleuze, for my taste at least, is this desire he has to replace essence with event, as it's put
Mm-hmm.
very simply in
Mm-hmm.
the Voda article. And instead, in Whitehead, it's not that essence is being replaced with event; it's that we have events or occasions, and what an occasion is um, a synthesis and individuation of eternal objects. In a sense, it's a making determinate of what was a kind of distributed definiteness. Whitehead makes this
Mm-hmm.
distinction between definiteness and
Yeah.
determinateness.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Determinateness is like it not only has definiteness of eternal objects to characterize it, but it has location. It has a place in a nexus of other occasions in space time.
Yeah.
Um, and so,
What do you think? Like there's a definiteness to a musician having an ability, but it's not determinate, like what songs they play or how that realizes itself or something like that.
right.
Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we know someone's personality, which is like
Mm-hmm.
a character
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that they express, but how that character expresses itself depends on the situation that they're in. And
Yeah. Yeah. And could surprise you and like do
yeah,
something new or something. Yeah.
mhm, definitely. But yeah, instead of replacing essence, I feel like Whitehead's taking away any efficient causal power from the
Mm-hmm.
eternal objects.
Mm-hmm. And representational, maybe like
Right.
representational
And
determinacy. Yeah.
represent, yeah, exactly. And so he's just so reimagining the idea of form, that it no longer is stuck in that representationalist
Yeah.
paradigm.
Yeah.
Um, but I feel like it still allows us to have these ideals, these lures.
Mm-hmm.
They're still a telos
Mm-hmm.
or maybe teloi, and
Mm-hmm.
they're logoi,
Mm-hmm.
operative in the natural world, and that allows cosmic evolution to have a tilt
Mm-hmm.
towards um, beauty in Whitehead sense. And because I just worry that with Deleuze, if it's just these rhizomatic um, lines of flight, it's like differentiation for the sake of differentiation, which I get what he's trying to liberate us from. Um, but it almost feels like liberation for the sake of what? Just
I
amor fati? What's that?
almost like it could go. That's the concern that I have too. Is and why I think I tend to go towards Bergson a little bit more is like liberation for the sake of what? So what's the ethics here? And granted, I haven't read as much of like Thousand Plateaus, for example, where they get into the more into political and ethical thought. But and that's also what I find asking myself is like we make all these parallels between Deleuze and Plotinus, but there doesn't seem to be any sort of the one or good um, in Deleuze, um, which I guess like liberation for what is it? I guess I say it in jest, like nihilism, but maybe like an optimistic sort of nihilism or
Well,
just freedom for the sake of freedom. I don't know, but I thought that's a good question.
I mean, I think that's where like where Spinoza's like coming in here is so interesting because Spinoza says like there's no good and evil. There's just what increases or decreases our power, right?
Mhm.
And ultimately, what increases our power for Spinoza? Like doing science, being just to people, forgiving people for their misdeeds, trying to see the best in people and draw more out of them than they know is possible, like things like that. Like, so it's I mean, you end up with like a Christian ethic like in some ways in the end of Spinoza's ethics, even though he wants to say like God does not have like decrees or something like that.
Is it Deleuze that calls Spinoza the Christ of philosophers?
Or the prince of philosophers, prince of philosophy or something.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
think.
is that what he
Yeah.
says? Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought, I mean, that's funny. Josiah Royce calls Schelling the Prince of Philosophy too. Or
Oh,
maybe
who
Prince of
does?
Idealism. Josiah Royce, the
Mm,
American idealist.
mm, mm,
Um, yeah, I mean, like there is a danger in affirming the good as the highest value, and that we think that we can define it in one way or another in some um, historically situated language. Uh,
But if there's like a problem with defining the good or like taking that idea, then aren't we presupposing again the good in the critique that we have of that
well,
position?
yeah, we have an intuition, but this is why like virtue ethics is obviously like superior to any other ethical scheme. Because like you can't come up with a system of rules, you can't have a categorical imperative. Like
Mhm, mhm,
it's not, being virtuous is the best we can do is put is hang out with people who we intuit are virtuous and
mhm,
like
mhm,
catch it from them.
mhm,
You
yeah.
can't like have it explained to you.
Mhm, mhm,
Because as soon as you try to explain it, you end up with some rigid doctrine.
yeah.
And it's not that like I think there's this kind of childish attitude about dogma that it's just this oppressive
Mhm,
thing that you have to conform to. But I think, if you value history and you value experience and like the um, wisdom that comes from experience and age and many, many generations, like really trying to navigate the complexity of human existence, it's like maybe some dogmas have been around and repeated and have because they've proven valuable on some level. So maybe we should at least,
mhm,
before we dismiss all dogmas, like take a look at them and try to understand
mhm,
them. But
mhm,
but still, I think when we when I want to affirm something like a transcendent good or good beyond being, it's not because I think I know how to tell you what that is
yeah.
in general.
Mhm,
I mean, we could talk about certain virtues like compassion and
mhm,
forgiveness and whatnot, but those are just like ways of triangulating, offering rough coordinates, but not telling you X marks the spot. Like,
mhm. Well, according to Spinoza and Deleuze, compassion is a weakness.
sure,
Passion or pity?
Pity, but yeah, I mean, compassion. Spinoza likes compassion. Yeah.
I guess this something I think about a lot is, for the most part, I've converted to Bergson. But there's still sometimes that Nietzschean voice in me, which thinks, why does there have to be a sort of asymptote or point of convergence for all these things? Um, and I guess in that sense, I agree. Like it's intuited, I guess. You have certain experiences that sort of give you this intuition, and the way we talk about it is fragmentary. But that's why I think one of the reasons I tend to lean more towards Bergson is because he does take mysticism and mystical experience seriously, where I haven't seen in Deleuze. And so in that sense, I see Deleuze as like, that's where the Nietzsche and Deleuze comes out. And in one sense, like I see that too, like the danger in like affirming a sort of dogmatic good as opposed to this openness to the spontaneity of creation of different forms of life, different ways of being. But I don't think that's mutually exclusive with, I guess, a
Mhm.
better idea of what goodness might mean. And even when
Well,
you talk
that's
about,
yeah.
or even when you talk about like like the different things that increase your power. Like I thought a lot of something I've thought a lot about is the will to power. But even then, why do these things increase your power? Is there nothing in nature that all these things that increase our power have in common, which we might call the one or the good? But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
well, I just this analogy comes to mind about what needs to shift to recover some sense of the good without regressing to the bad form of essentialism that I think Deleuze rightly wants to overcome. If we think about the sun as the principal analogy that Plato uses and Plotinus returns to, um, it's neat, first of all, that there's already this sort of secret heliocentrism in Pythagorean and Platonic philosophy, but they thought of the sun as the still center, not moving, just like the one is still. And now we know it's not still, it moves too. And that sense of relative motion, if even um, the sun or the good in this analogy, I think suggests that we need to give sort of an evolutionary vector to this, so that it's not just a vertical ascent to the one anymore, or this asymptotic approach to a static sense of goodness, but that we're always in a process of becoming good, as it were. It's an evolutionary process, and it's not a attempt to return to what we've lost, or to climb a ladder out of the world, but to become more whatever this is, more
yeah, exactly.
actualized. Yeah.
Yeah. And to just, again, like you said, like change our attention or our comportment or our way of being, our style of being within the world, rather than escaping from it or something like that.
Right.
And I mean, the convergence question I think is really important, and I think it brings in. I mean, like, do the mystics like converge in a single doctrine, or and does metaphysics like end in everybody agreeing? And like, I don't know where these things would actually end up for Bergson. I mean, I think he thinks that, and this is where like the tension with Deleuze and like Platonism and these things are all, I mean, they're all present there in, like, you have Deleuze already in Bergson, but you also still have Plato still, and like especially in the ethical works, and you have this Nietzschean kind of aspect to it as well. And like, I mean, I definitely think Bergson, with his idea of the virtual and creative emotions and things like that, is Dionysian, right? Like he talks about like mysticism is the Dionysian element in
Mm.
Bergson's thinking, right? Um, and he wants, I mean, he says in the end of the two sources, what we need is a balance of discipline and mysticism. So Apollo and Dionysus, right? Um, and I think Nietzsche, on a good day, still wants there to be Apollo to some degree. He's not like full antichrist all the time. Um, and so take it to Spinoza again, because he rejects teleology, but still has a philosophy of power that is based on striving. And striving is kind of teleology without an eternal structure above it or something like that, right? Kanatos. And so we can increase, so when we work more synergistically with others, we increase our power.
Mm.
And that means we increase our perfection. And we actually participate more in the intellect. So we are expanding the infinite connectedness and our ability to kind of uh, parallax things, right? Like I really love this idea of the kaleidoscope from Bergson, but like being able to take a multiplicity and see it from a bunch of different angles in a useful way that does something, right? I think that is what increasing our power. I mean, in the same way, like you learn a triangle in geometry, but then you can do all these different things on parallelograms, and you can even do architecture and things like that. You can take something small and get way more out of it by working the intellect and going through all these interstitial virtual pathways within the intellect. So he'll call that like an increase in our power and our blessedness. He doesn't want to say good, But it's like at the end of the day, dude, like, is this did you not bring back in teleology as an open teleology? And did you not bring back in the good as blessedness and power and these things?
Yeah, I think you just voiced my intuitions very well. Thank you, Jack.
Well, I mean, I think that the Spinoza connection to me, especially thinking through Deleuze, and I didn't share this with you guys, but there's a lecture series he gave on Spinoza in the 80s where he talks a bunch about emanation, and he brings up Plotinus, and he's like comparing Spinoza and Plotinus here. And yeah, I don't know. I just feel that there are certain moves that they're making, that Deleuze and Spinoza, that appear to be revolutionarily moving beyond Plato or Platonism or Plotinus or whatever. But if you mull them over, it's actually a very similar position, just with a different emphasis, right? I don't know. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And emphases that we find Plotinus give at times when he kind of tries to undermine the simplicity of his emanationist ontology for something like an immanent um, panpsychist view.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Like,
Yeah.
I like those reflections on power, and it's easy to mistake something like the will to power for an ethics of selfishness, but like who is the self? And it could be that through associations we discover higher forms of selfhood and interests that are um
Yeah.
not just individual but shared.
I mean, that's where Spinoza lands, right? He's like, the most selfish thing you can do is like try to live in community, because it makes your life and everyone else's lives better and makes you like a more blessed being that understands the way things work.
Yeah. um there's this organizational theorist that develops applies some of Whitehead's ideas in metaphysics to political and business organization and whatnot. Mary Parker Follett, she was writing in like the 1920s, but she talked about coactive power in this sense, and that it's
Coactive.
coactive power. Um, just pointing out the ways that when human beings come into association and to negotiate something, like we think in democracies usually, oh, we're supposed to compromise our interests, but she's like, well, if you're really open and making yourself vulnerable to the encounter with others in these negotiating sessions, actually the interests you showed up with are going to change.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And you're not compromising so much as realizing there's a way of increasing value beyond what you thought you could get just through compromise if you're willing to be transformed by others, and in turn they're transformed by you. And so you actually end up being able to realize more power if you can authentically encounter and be transformed in the encounter, so that your interests evolve as a result of the encounter. Then you, as a group, as an association, become capable of so much more than had you just settled for compromise.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, there's an ethics even in this will to power, if you understand power beyond just some Darwinian struggle for existence among individuals.
Nietzsche talks about that. He says he actually calls, and Deleuze points this out in his book on Nietzsche, that interpreting the will to power as this kind of Hobbesian desire for power, that's the slave interpretation of power. That what Nietzsche really meant, the master's interpretation of will to power, has more to do with a sort of Spinozan ethics of individual power and self-overcoming, as opposed to overcoming having external power. So it's definitely there. It's just the struggle I always had with Nietzsche is I guess he like when you pointed to, I liked what you put, like mysticism and Dionysian to get like Dionysus together, and that the interesting thing about what a Nietzschean mysticism is. But yeah, I don't know. I'm having trouble thinking about it now, but I think something about Bergson and mysticism just appealed to me in a way that it took everything that I saw in Nietzsche, that I actually see something very positive in an ethics of will to power, but then gave it, I guess, more of a metaphysical foundation that just squared with some intuitions that I had. But I do think that Nietzsche, like reading Nietzsche's Will to Power, is just, power over people. Is he said it himself? It's the slave's interpretation of power.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
I think there's like this relation between power and ethics that is like, the more I've been thinking about it recently, and it's an idea that comes up in Plato and in the French spiritualist tradition, that like ethics is predicated on our knowledge of powers. So a basic example is like, you feel the duty to do something in a certain situation because you feel you could do something, right? Someone needs help. I mean, even like, you think the trolley problem, whatever, all you need in the trolley problem is the fact that you feel like you should do something in this situation, right? The knowledge that you can do something is the basis of moral emotions and sentiments. So, and this, I mean, this doesn't mean we have all of our abilities already. Like, a musician feels, I need to practice. And if I practice, I become better. And so I feel a calling, a vocation, a duty almost to see that through. Right. And I think that there's something like this in Nietzsche and in Deleuze that is like irreducible, right? Like, why does Deleuze, like you were saying, Matt, like, is this just, I mean, you could say like deconstruction for the sake of deconstruction, or lines of flight for the sake of lines of flight or something. And I do
Let's
think
just do
there's,
lines. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's some kind of like, not exhibitionist, but like, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Like, this kind of like acrobatic almost, like, how far can we go with metaphysics, with all of these things, and Deleuze, whatever he's doing. But I think that the underlying kernel is that we, even in philosophy, it's like there's this sense of like, what if I could put a bunch of effort into this and something like epic comes out of it, and I have ideas and insights, and
Yeah.
that what if, as a kind of calling to fulfill a power, to pursue a power, to develop and expound, or I don't know, that's not the right word. Expand. Yeah.
Yeah. Explore.
Yeah. Explode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this joy in Deleuze, and that comes from reading Deleuze, is similar to Nietzsche, that
Mm-hmm.
is just the sheer delight we take in problematizing
Mm-hmm.
ideas and
Yeah.
dramatizing
Right.
ideas, and
Yeah.
um, you know, interacting, engaging with conceptual concepts as personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think it is a sort of end in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Mm-hmm. Right.
doesn't need further justification, unless we want a more robust like ethics of some kind. Um, but there are hints. There are plenty of more than hints. I mean, I was thinking of what Deleuze and Guattari say, and what is philosophy about agonism and the importance of like friendly enemies in dialectical engagement, so that in pursuit of something, maybe not capital T truth, but something truer, you need that back and forth. And so, like Jack, you were asking earlier, like, does metaphysics end with everyone agreeing?
Mm-hmm.
And I immediately thought of, the way you were describing Plotinus, kind of wrestling with Aristotle, wrestling with Plato, not to prove them wrong, but just literally struggling with their ideas
Mm-hmm.
to become stronger, to gain more deeper understanding oneself. And so after, what metaphysics never ends, or doesn't end with everyone agreeing, it ends, its end, as it were, its purpose is precisely in that dialectical wrestling match,
Mm-hmm.
where like we're friends engaged in some degree of, it's not like competitiveness, it's not competitive in the sense that one of us is trying to win,
Mm-hmm.
but we're all oriented towards some transcendent aim, some good, and we do our best to, in participating in the logos dialectically, to strengthen one another's arguments on the way towards that.
Mm-hmm.
you know
And even by participating in that activity together, we're in a shared eidetic space. Like even if we don't have the same doctrines or the same ideas, well, I don't want to use that word ideas, but like the idea is the engagement, right? And that
Yeah.
part is shared, even if Aristotle has certain ideas that are different than Plato, and Plotinus has different ideas, they all agree, not in the details, but in the spirit of the philosophical engagement.
Yeah, they harmonize. Like even the dissonances are
Mm-hmm,
beautiful sometimes.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Or it's our job to become adequate to the harmony in a way to hear the music even when there are
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
irreconcilable ideas. It's
Mm-hmm.
like
And I think too, this idea of the dialectic, like within that, there's a whole dynamism of virtual and actual, right? And this way in which you deepen the virtual and you pull all these connections together and you actualize something, and then that changes the virtual and changes the horizon of our potentiality, and in a way gives us a new calling, right? As Bergson, for example, develops through his own career, right? And from book to book, he finds new callings at each time. Like after Matter Memory, he's like, I have to write a freaking book about evolution now and like unpack all these things I had never thought about, right? So I do think there's like an ethics and a morality of power, even within that flow in someone's, you know, inner and
yeah.
outer growth.
Mhm. Hmm. Hmm.
It, maybe just to I guess get back to the idea of I guess the Deleuzian scheme and how that works. Um, so what we talked about earlier feels like it so long ago now, but what y'all said when I asked about the intensive and internal objects makes sense. I was thinking of, there's I guess the difference between red as we see it and red as the eternal object. So red as we see it, I guess, would be the intensive, and there's still the eternal object or the actuality of red, which is not something ever directly perceived. So that was helpful. And then what Jack said about prehension is kind of the intensive that brings all these things together. Um, and the question that I wrote down when I was reading is, so when again, the limitation of spatial metaphors, you think of a rhizome, you think of everything I think of nodes and lines essentially with no center all connected together. But that kind of assumes that they're on the same level of dimensionality. I just see like black and white lines with like a purple background all connecting together. But if you're thinking about, say, the virtual, the intensive, and the actual, again, I think again there's a limitation to the spatial metaphor of the rhizome. Like so, because how do you think of the connection between the virtual, the intensive, and the actual rhizomatically? Like I feel like I can't do that spatially, but I'm just wondering how I think maybe that's just a point where I think like Milich Čapek, for example, is a Bergsonian slash Whiteheadian philosopher of physics, talks about the limitation in the, for example, the corpuscular kinetic view or the mechanistic view, that it makes sense because of the needs of our intelligence or perception for action, to think about the world in this way, but it's just metaphysically wrong. And so I don't know. I was wondering how you conceive of combine the, I guess, concept or metaphor of the rhizome with this tripartite metaphysics that Deleuze has. Like, maybe this is just a case where we can only talk about it in words and imagery won't work. But I don't know. I don't know if
I
that
mean,
can,
I think,
I guess, the question that I'm getting at here.
well, not maybe to even directly answer the question, but just to say quickly that, like, I think that the metaphoric use in Deleuze is very similar to Plotinus in a way, because it works on a certain level, but it also needs to be, gestalt shifted and given a completely different metaphor that probably undermines the other metaphor, right? And so I think Deleuze wants to like unfold certain ideas within that metaphor, but he does kind of scrap it in favor of others at times and then brings it back, whatever. Like, but we see that in Plotinus, and I think that's kind of the Bergsonian and Plotinian thing where you can use metaphors, but there's always limitations to them. Um, and they kind of run aground at a certain point.
Yeah, I was wondering if the spatial metaphors seem so inadequate, what if we started to try to use temporal metaphors.
That's exactly what I wrote down.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wrote down is like how can we shift would a temporal metaphor essentially be better to describe this tripartite metaphysics as opposed to like this kind of spatial rhizomatic one?
Mhm.
Mm, mm,
Yeah. I mean, I'm not as clear on how to do that immediately with Deleuze, but with Whitehead, you can talk about um, real potentiality or definite potentiality in terms of the past, and actualization is always happening in the present, and
mm,
pure potentiality or generic potentiality, you could say, is in the future.
mm,
Um, in the sense that it's not yet definite because it needs to be in relationship to actuality to
mm,
be definite, and
mm,
the future can't be in relationship to anything. It hasn't happened yet, but it
mm,
still is possible.
mm, mm,
Um, we know there will be a future. Um, and so now this allows you, I mean, Whitehead wants us to think of, as does Deleuze, I think, of events not happening in space or a
mm,
preconstituted container,
mm.
but rather bringing forth
Yeah,
space as the kind of wake left behind
right.
the the process of actualization.
Which
Mm.
again seems like Plotinus could agree with
Mm.
that, right? I mean, he says
Uh,
these things like there's uh the the true universe or something like that, and he connects this with the world soul and stuff like that, and how it uh yeah, I don't know, provides the intensive precursor to actualization.
mm,
And then we actualize our individual souls um,
right.
out of that kind of virtual. Um,
Yeah. I mean, time seems like a line from the perspective of nature or
mm,
bodies, but from the
mm,
perspective of the soul, it's a circle. And
mm,
so there's a
mm,
kind of wholeness. Time is manifest as a whole to the soul,
mm,
put it that
mm,
way. So
mm,
that, which isn't necessarily implied like determinism, but it does imply
mm,
um, that time is not just a contingent historical
yeah.
process, but
Mm-hmm.
that it is,
Something like that the soul produces almost, right?
yeah, it's a moving image
Yeah.
of eternity. It's not just
Mm.
one damn thing after the next.
He stops in the middle of one of these and says, "Are we? Who are we?" There's a pause like that. I read it the way. Oh, so sorry. I said, "And we, who are we?" Sorry. Yeah, yeah. Are we what approaches and comes to be in time? And then he just like keeps going. I don't know if this is Porphyry. Like,
That's funny. That's the line that Ian McGilchrist uses to start as the epigraph to the matter with things.
oh wow,
Who are we?
yeah, yeah.
That's neat. I didn't know.
Mm.
So that's in and yeah,
6
4 or
4
5, 6 4.
14. Yeah.
Okay, neat.
Yeah, I mean this idea of like well, he also uses this image of there's a voice speaking and it fills the air and like all these different people can hear it, and it's like nobody hearing it detracts from that
Mm.
actuality, right? Like we're not siphoning off some of it. It's this intensive thing, right? And the soul out each of our individual souls is active because we're hearing the voice of the universal soul or the uh, world soul. Um, so I don't know. That's such an interesting metaphor because I think, is it still emanationist or not? Because at this point, the point is that the voice is not emitting from the mouth and filling the air. It's that it's in the air always, and it doesn't change, and it only says one word, or he even said like I don't know,
Mm.
and but we all can hear it, and when we do hear it, then we are living human beings because we're stimulated by the activity of hearing it.
So we want to get over the triple O God, but there's this other fourth O of omnipresence that maybe
Mm.
we want to hang on to, right? So no more omniscience, omnipotence, and well, what was the third one? omnibenevolent
Benevolence.
benevolence. That one's not so bad.
It's not really that bad at all.
Let's keep that one.
But yeah, this omnipresence of the one. It's like when at the beginning of Zavoda's paper, there was another theorist who was trying to describe
Hmm. Oh, the
Plotinus as
creationist, instrumental creationism or something.
yeah, or right. That was Lloyd Gerson. But then there was someone else who thought that maybe Plotinus is a pantheist of some kind.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But it seems to me he's more pantheist in the sense that he's saying, because he explicitly denies that the one is not just all things, not just a summation of everything. The one is beyond being, beyond even the totality of beings. And but in this in these metaphors of like the voice and the shining without the center and just having the light fill the whole sphere, it's more like panentheism in the sense that the one is present in each of the many, or present to each of the many.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I mean, this is exactly where I want to like push the question of Deleuze and Spinoza and stuff, because I think Spinoza could say something really similar where he would want to say God is present in each of us as the expressive power of moving and thinking and doing things and expressing ourselves, right? So like there still is this, even though we're these created beings being pushed around by things in the universe, we have within us, especially through our intellect for Spinoza, the power to actualize the world in the same way that God does, because we are God actualizing the world when we do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in that, oh yeah, just very quick, in that sense, God is the same in all of us because God is the creative principle of differentiation. So it's that kind of like paradoxical same other thing. It's the same because it's different.
Yeah. I think nowadays people tend to hear that term meaning something like our ability to manipulate abstractions or something. But I think in this sense, it's more like reason. It's this organic, intuitive power of grasping wholeness, and not just not the mere understanding that's always fragmenting things and only gaining an abstract understanding of the world.
Yeah, I think that the intellect is the virtual that exceeds the actualization of our thinking, right? Like if we're like, again, if we're thinking about something in geometry, virtually the entire whole of geometry and the entire whole of like interconnected movements that relate to each other, like almost intelligence is the interlege, right? Like the interweaving, lege being like tie together. It's this intertying of things. So as soon as you enter the intellectual side for Plotinus, you're thinking about the whole, the interconnection, what is greater than the context. And it's almost just this like ecological web principle than anything else.
Should we start translating Bergson, his use of intellect in a different ways to avoid this? Right, because that's an issue.
He does both though. That's the problem. Like
yeah.
Wait, can you repeat the question, Matt?
Well, I'm just thinking of the way Bergson distinguishes intellect and intuition.
Yeah.
Because the thing is like Plato's highest form of knowing, noesis, is more like what Bergson means by intuition.
Yeah.
But I think when Plotinus is speaking about the nous, and we've been saying intellect, we're talking more about what Bergson means by intuition, not what he means by intellect as the mechanical, cinematographic way of freeze framing everything. That's more like the understanding.
There's a moment in the Cratylus where Socrates says something like the word knowing, nous, knowing, has a Yoda in it, a little I, and the Yoda this is like partially comedic, but like metaphysically so rich. The Yoda is this small thing that kind of runs through things, and it turns out in Greek you can like have Yodas that get sucked into other letters, like there's Yoda subscripts, whatever. But he says the Yoda is this thing that runs through everything and is the kind of web of fabric that is hidden. Like almost he brings up this Heraclitean, like the hidden connection between everything. So the intellect is our access to the hidden web that connects everything. And I think
Right.
that's really this like virtual, um, subtle, or you could say, what's the other term? Implicit, latent, these kinds of things. Anyway, that popped in my head, but
I might need to get Yoda in the thumbnail for this video. We'll see.
yeah.
Well, that makes me wonder, talk about these different kinds of cognition, what becomes of contemplation in Deleuze's framework. Um, he talks about, I think, if I recall correctly, in Difference Repetition, he talks about the process of actualization as what
Yeah,
contemplation
it's really
is.
important there. Mhm.
But
And
I
he
guess,
says these things like everything is contemplation, or yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that's what I get confused, that like, does it just become, is the process of actualization just is the term contemplation democratized and used to talk about all forms of actualization and just get rid completely of like noesis, for example? Um, I don't know if there's anything of like an equivalent to noesis for in a sort of Deleuzean ontology. I don't think I know enough to say that, but it's just interesting what becomes of contemplation and with Deleuze.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Hmm.
I mean, he certainly seems like he's against a sort of rough Platonism. Again, maybe it's not Plato, but where there's these arche that we can have an intuition of, and they're just a kind of like stopping point where everything emerges from them. And maybe there's an emanationist approach to that. Um, so I don't think I mean, I think he wants to kind of side skirt that, but he definitely sounds exactly like Plotinus when he says everything, like everything's contemplation, and there's contemplation within, I guess, the syntheses of time and things like that.
And maybe just the difference is like, let's just get rid of the one, we can have
Mm,
contemplation, the actualization of the virtual without saying that it's a contemplation of something above.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
that's the point. But
Well, if the one is infinitely productive, then maybe the one is very much like Spinoza's natura naturans, right? And then we can think of things like the plane of consistency and bodies without organs and things like that as Deleuze's way of reframing the idea of the one and God and these things, and really repeating the same basic ideas, though.
Hmm. Yeah. It's the whole, I mean, you can, there's the footnotes to Plato comment, but it's also like the history of philosophy is just the continual like inversion of Plato over and over and over, like folding and then refolding and then refolding
Mm-hmm.
Plato.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Now you need a Plato
mhm. Is
thumbnail.
it, do you think the was it Mattel that invented Plato, the because it's like such a good metaphor for the forms and the
Yeah.
matter. It's a very holomorphic pedagogical tool.
Yeah.
Um, but
very
no,
much
I mean, Play-Doh.
like a very
Um,
Derridian move.
what else have we what else should we mention before we wrap up here? Is there anything either of you had
I read an
noted?
interesting thing about the Mino recently that you guys might, I think, just like plays into all of this sort of weird alternate readings of Plato that are kind of Deleuzian and kind of Nietzschean and Bergsonian and stuff, where, you know, Mino's, so the Mino, he has this slave boy, and Socrates proves that he can do geometry, at least, right, without having learned it. Or what I think we can say is that he, oh, my sister's calling me. I think we can say is that from a more Deleuzian perspective. So, I mean, okay, the Platonist thing would be to say this proves the doctrine of recollection, which says that our souls existed before we were born and we beheld the forms in that time. and that we can naturally do geometry because we're just remembering it. Well, the alternate thing is to say that philosophy and dialectic, and when someone talks to Socrates, it has the power of awakening in anyone the power to invent geometry or to come to those truths through their own inventive discovery, right? So I think that that's kind of the more, I mean, I think that that can even hold whether or not we accept the rest of the Platonic baggage. Wow, my sister's really trying to get me. Whether or not we accept the other world prior to our life where all truth was already gained, I think what it shows is that there's something about the philosophical activity that awakens in us a kind of daimon or intellect or whatever you want to call it that is capable of far more than we know is capable of, like inventing geometry for itself.
Right. But we need the soul needs the midwife to like
Yeah,
as the mnemonic to
right. You need the dialectic of Socrates in order
awaken
to
it.
get there. Or, I mean, there are, you know, like you could get this from interacting with the world, right? There are certain things you might run into in the world. Like, presumably, the first people who were worried about how to measure the diagonal of a square against the side didn't have some pedagogical teacher.
No, they
And
were Egyptian farmers, right?
yeah, presumably, right? Yeah.
Or some farmers probably.
Yeah.
Or the um tax collectors uh trying to make sure the farmers weren't scraping any excess profits.
Mm. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
instrumentalize
no, no. It's like
deep Pythagorean
very
mystery.
concrete.
No, but there's something to the material aspect of things because also like can't teach geometry to a dog, right? So and there's a material basis to all of this too.
Mhm,
Mhm.
Sort of material conditions have to be there for these things to, what, I don't know, come to light or be actualized as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, like that's so important. Like what's the productive role of the body and different types of bodies in supporting certain types of thoughts?
Mhm,
Yeah,
I think that's what's under theorized in this lineage, this Platonic lineage. That
I think his strength in Nietzsche is asking, so not so much the veracity of whatever a philosopher says, but what sort of material conditions came together in his
mhm,
anatomy, physiology, environment for him to say such a thing.
mhm,
I think that's a very interesting approach to philosophy.
mhm, mhm,
yeah.
mhm.
Yeah, he's a lot of interesting things to say about diet and um but you there's this great line in Pierre Terre de Chardin in the very beginning of the Human Phenomenon where he's like, we need bread to think, but what different thoughts can come from the same slice of bread?
Mm. Nice.
Like, yes, there are material limits here, but
Mhm, mhm,
thought has its own source of spontaneity or something, I guess
mhm,
is the point.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, all right, guys, I feel like we're all petered out at Friday,
Yeah.
exhausted from teaching, but this was really generative for me.
Mhm,
Looking forward to reading the transcript and um, writing something together, whether
yeah.
that's I think we talked about an intro to translation, but also this idea of truth as participation and the pedagogical reading,
Mhm, mhm,
Yeah.
Plato's
mhm,
divided line.
mhm, mhm,
So yeah, let's keep that idea alive and email about it. I'm about to go to town for 2 weeks, so I might not
mhm,
be
mhm.
too responsive in the near term, but I'll be back before the end of the month.
Well, how about what if we just try and set a meeting up for May at some
Okay.
point? Maybe even like more like the 15th or the 20th or even
Perfect.
after that.
After we
Maybe
finish
after the
writing
20th.
papers. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And what if we do what we said we were going to do from the start, which was like read some of Bergson's lectures together and just talk about it.
Mhm. Sure. Do you want to pick which lectures? more on
I mean, I was
Plotinus?
thinking the ones from my translation, but maybe like a later chapter, like something like I think the chapter on consciousness is really good, or the one on the world soul.
Mhm. Yeah, actually,
Those two are really
that'd be great because I think you had sent an earlier draft or something.
Oh shit. Yeah, yeah. I'll send you the right one.
Yeah, yeah. Love to reread that.
Mhm.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool. I like
I
that
hope,
plan.
hope the rest of the semester ends well for both of you.
Thank you.
You
Y'all
as well.
too.
Keep your heads above water.
I know.
Yeah.
And
safe,
yeah,
safe travels.
thank you.
Yeah. Really enjoy that. That's gonna be amazing.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah,
England, Ireland.
England, Ireland. Yeah. Mhm.
Amazing.
Heck yeah. Awesome. I'm looking forward to reading more Bergson and writing with you guys. So
Beautiful.
Likewise. Good to be in dialogue,
Yeah, thanks again for
friends.
setting this up. This is really generative. I really want to like teach a class on Plotinus sometime, Matt, if you ever want to in like
Sure.
2 years do co-teach a class.
I'd love to see that syllabus.
Yeah. Well, I don't have any idea what would be on it at this point.
Well,
Oh, I'll
we'll
also send you the Deleuze lecture
mm,
on Spinoza where he talks about. It's interesting that the article, as far as I remember, I have to go back and look very carefully, but doesn't cite this
mm,
these lectures. But yeah,
mm. Yeah, send it all.
cool. I think also there's I just remembered this today. There's a passage in Desert Islands. Do you guys have the text Desert Islands by Deleuze? It's like a collection of his
Oh,
articles and things. There's one or two articles in there on Bergson, and one of them I remembered has a reference to Ravesson and Plotinus. So I'm gonna go back and find that as well, and we'll try and like bring these together as well. So
cool. All right, friends.
sweet.
Have a good
Thanks, guys.
weekend.
Yeah, y'all too. Have a good night.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.